some of these studies with heart disease, and if you eat this food, it's like, oh, you have a 17% increased chance of getting heart disease if you eat this fat or that fat, right? This isn't that. This is 500 times, or sorry, 500%. This is 5x. So this is hugely, you're 5 times is more likely to get diabetes if you are desaturating your linoleic acid.
Our neighbor's choice.
Well, I'm back for another discussion on nutrition. Your host, David Gornoski, here with my friend Brad Marshall from Fire in a Bottle. How you doing, Brad?
I'm doing well. It's been a busy summer, but I'm hanging in there and having fun.
Well, it got super busy when I crashed Buffalo, New York to visit you. That was a lot of fun. That was great to see you.
That is true. Yeah,
That was the first time we had
David was
met
here
in
for.
person, you know? So you were a gracious host,
Yeah,
showed me around and almost slipped off into Niagara Falls there on the slippery slopes there. And I had
yeah, we made it to
I
Niagara
had
Falls.
the mispleasure of wearing shoes with no grips, just pure slippery. And I started slipping and sliding around some of the Asian tourists there, and I felt, God, they're going to see a catastrophe if I tip over this railing here, you know?
Yeah, yeah, that's that's right.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and there was the woman with the selfie stick and the light canning and the faux tipping back over the falls. It was a good time.
I wasn't going to try that. But we had a great time, and the spirit of Nikola Tesla was in the air because we were really thinking about all the big picture stuff like we do on our shows together, and it was great to have those conversations in person. And I was doing all the I was trying to get in as much science conversations in with you as I could while I pulled you into some touristy stuff, right? But we had fun. So.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it was great. Good times and yeah, delightful.
So we wanted to pick up where some of your blog posts have been going since we last talked, and we might have missed some of them on your series about the whistle pig and the hare. And I'm out here in the Rocky Mountains in the West right now, so it's kind of funny. It's like I'm really close by to Nikola Tesla's station in Colorado Springs, where he had the tower doing all those amazing experiments with the ionosphere and directing energy across great distances. And and then I just come back from Buffalo where he was over there, and then in between those weeks I was at the Tesla Tech conference. I can't get away from Nikola Tesla. None of this was planned in this way, but it's all worked out in the universe. But you've got some posts here that are close to home. Linoleic acid is stealing your oxygen. Now, I can feel that right now because I'm at over 7,000 feet elevation, and I don't know. Last year when I was out in the high elevation, I was at 9,000 feet. For some reason, I haven't. I don't feel like I've adapted as efficiently as I did last year. And I don't know if it's because I ate too much linoleic acid in Buffalo with some of those wings I was trying, but I wanted to get you on to explain all this.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thanks for having me. And it's so the linoleic acid is stealing your oxygen is sort of my big. This is much of what I write on Fire in a Bottle is it's based on papers in the literature, right? It's based on research that I've done. It's based on um here's the 10 papers that support this thing that I'm saying, right? The linoleic acid is stealing your oxygen is kind of my big uh this is kind of my big theory that I'm putting forward into the world and ultimately hope to be able to prove it. Um, and so that is essentially that, people think about the mitochondria as the place in the cell where oxygen is burned, where oxygen is consumed, right? And we have this idea that we have the cell, and in there's the mitochondria, and the mitochondria is creating all this ATP by essentially burning our food, our fuels. Our fuels go into the mitochondria, and they get burned with oxygen, and ATP comes out, and that's how the cell works. But in reality, there are processes in the not in the mitochondria and the other parts of the cell that don't create ATP, and it's in those parts of the cell that I believe is sort of competing for oxygen with, and I think that's a really concept, and it has not really been widely discussed, but there are a whole host of enzymes in the endoplasmic reticulum, which is essentially wrapped around the mitochondria, and I believe that the two organelles are actually competing for oxygen supply, and I think that that's sort of where the rubber hits the road in all this. Um, the and what does linoleic acid have to do with that? Well, one of the primary pathways that uses oxygen is the limiting step is this desaturase enzyme called D6D, and you don't have to memorize that, but it's this enzyme, and it adds another so polyunsaturated fats. We call them that because they have uh, two double bonds, right? A saturated fat doesn't have any double bonds. It's all carbon single bonded to carbon, and then hydrogens binded to the carbons. Whenever you add a double bond, you have two bonds between these carbons, and the molecule bends, and that's why the polyunsaturated fats are more liquid than the saturated fats. Soybean oil is more liquid than butter. Um, and so in these polyunsaturated fats, if you add one more, linoleic acid is in soybean oil, it's in corn oil, and it already has two double bonds and it's very liquid. If you add one more double bond to it, which by the way consumes oxygen, not in the mitochondria, but it consumes oxygen in the cytoplasm. When you add that other double bond to it, now you've sent it down this pathway where it's going to get desaturated a second time. That's going to take more oxygen to do that. And it's going to go into a membrane. It's going to get inserted. Now once it's been desaturated twice, now it becomes this thing called arachidonic acid. Um, and it's going to go into a membrane. And once arachidonic acid is in your cell membranes, there are these enzymes that are constantly releasing it, and it's floating as a free fatty acid, and then they're reattaching it to the membrane. So we have the cycle all the time where these phospholipid, these fats that are in these membranes are constantly being released and reattached. And the reason for that, or what that allows, is that whenever they're released, there's these other enzymes that can act on those free fatty acids, and they can actually oxidize those fatty acids even more. So, they have complicated names like cytochrome P450 and cyclooxygenase. Um, don't focus on complicated names, but um, every time that they're kind of cycling in and out of the membranes. They're just being released and reattached and released and reattached and released and reattached. And when they're released, they can be, like I say, they can get oxidized more. You can stick another oxygen molecule on there, and again, that burns oxygen. And then, Ray Peat talked about eliminating polyunsaturated fat when you pee, and that happens through this process called glucuronidation. And again, don't get too caught up on the terms, but what happens is there's these enzymes, the thing about fats, of course, is they're fat soluble. They like being with other fats, they don't like to float around in your blood. And so what glucuronidation does is it sticks water soluble compounds onto these fats. And now they can circulate in the blood, and now you can eliminate them in your urine fairly easily. And so um, these polyunsaturated fats are getting oxidized and oxidized and oxidized, and then they get glucuronidated, and ultimately they can and do come out in the urine, and that's how they get eliminated. But the take home message is that every step of that pathway, the initial desaturation by D6D, the second desaturation by D5D, the oxidation by the cytochrome P450 enzymes, all of those steps are using oxygen outside of the mitochondria, and they're essentially in the endoplasmic reticulum. They're competing for oxygen with the mitochondria, and that process can happen continuously. Um, these membranes, like I say, are very dynamic. The 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 linoleic acid can be continually converted by D6D into arachidonic acid, and since they're constantly being detached and re-released and glucuronidated, you essentially have this flow through this enzyme pathway. And so, when I wrote the "Can you stand in the same cell membrane twice?" Right, that's the article on Fire in a Bottle, and that's a reference to there's a someone once said, can you ever stand in the same river twice? Meaning that, rivers are constant motion, things are, logs and boulders are constantly moving through the river and being pushed down current, and it rains, and now there's more water and it's less. And so, the river is a very dynamic um, place. And that is the analogy that I was making. And so, in this analogy, the water flowing through the river is the polyunsaturated fats moving through this process of linoleic acid becoming oxidized to arachidonic acid, becoming oxidized to things like 15 heat and 20 heat and 11 heat, and those things ultimately being excreted in the urine, right? And that pathway operates continuously. And interestingly, if you are, we have ways of um, the gatekeeper enzyme of this whole pathway is the one called D6D, delta 6 desaturase. And if you have high activity of that enzyme, you are 500% more likely to develop diabetes over the next 5 years, according to a study done in Northern Europe called the EPIC Potsdam study. And what they showed is it's a simple ratio of the linoleic to the thing that linoleic acid becomes once this enzyme has acted on it, and that act of the initial desaturation of linoleic acid is the thing that unleashes this whole pathway. um and in my mind, it is scientifically proven. We've done Mendelian randomization studies that suggest that this pathway being active is causative of diabetes. It's not just simply correlation. Like I say, the risk factor of 500%, right? It's not that means you're 5 times as likely to get diabetes if you're oxidizing a lot of linoleic acid. So that's not, some of these studies with heart disease, and if you eat this food, it's like, oh, you have a 17% increased chance of getting heart disease if you eat this fat or that fat, right? This isn't that. This is 500 times, or sorry, 500%. This is 5x. So this is hugely, you're 5 times is more likely to get diabetes if you are desaturating your linoleic acid, right? And so that to me just screams like there's been this debate going on. And I posted this article called "Linoleic Acid Causes Diabetes" at fireandbottle.net, and I'm just making the point in the quick video that I made there, that when you see a risk factor that's you're 500 times more likely to get diabetes if you're oxidizing linoleic acid. Then I think that there's, where there's smoke, there's fire, right? This is the smoking gun, as it were. I always feel I have that analogy, but uh, there's been a lot of questioning from the, I guess, the I don't know, the anti seed oil people now, that saying that, a lot of people who have been warning about seed oils are saying things like, oh, the seed oils oxidize and that's bad and that does damage. And um but in some of the, the dietary trials, you don't necessarily see the immediate direct impact on things like inflammatory markers. And so they've been making this argument that there's no there there. Um, and the there, I believe, are these studies showing that this delta 6 desaturase is the gatekeeper of diabetes, heart disease, and I highlight this one paper. It's freely available. It's got really nice tables that are a lot of people can read. There's a lot of reasons that I like this paper, but there's 20 other papers that corroborate this idea that this delta 6 desaturase, if it's elevated, is really bad news. And the fuel of delta 6 desaturase is linoleic acid, um, and also linolenic acid, the omega 3 plant-based fat. But um, so what I see is, I see this massively increased risk based on this one enzyme that no one is really talking about in the community. And this isn't new news. This isn't some uh, hot thing. The paper I'm talking about came out in 2011. This is all old news, but um, for whatever reason, no one talks about it. So that's what I do, I guess. I like, things that have been proven in humans, and in my opinion, this has been proven in humans to be just massively important, right? Massively important and massively overlooked by both, you know, people in the alternative health community, and interestingly, massively overlooked by American scientists. All these papers are from Northern Europe, some are from Spain, some are from China, but very few papers in America about the importance of this delta 6 desaturase. Um, in Finland, I think they did a trial showing the genetic variations in this delta 6 desaturase region, and how when they give people linoleic acid, the amount of linoleic acid that's converted to these oxidized uh, omega 6 fats is tightly correlated to the genetic variant of the D6D enzyme that they have. And there's just, there's just massive uh, numbers of papers and massive amounts of evidence that, like, this is where we need to look. This is where the fire is, as it were, or maybe lack of fire in this case. Um, I'm trying to think.
Lack of fire because it's cooling down, it's losing power. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, yeah, because fire, of course, I make the fire analogy all the time because metabolism is really the same thing as fire, right? Fire is, if you took if you take glucose, you can burn it, right? It literally, it burns, and that's that fire that you see. I mean, wood is made out of glucose. Wood is just a type of glucose that's kind of cross-linked, right? And wood obviously burns. And so when you see those flames being given off by the wood, that's just the kind of energy of the wood rearranging itself. And your mitochondria does that same thing. It's just, it does it all, dissolved in water. So, but the mitochondria really is fire. The same essential process is happening as in fire, right? The energy is moving from the fuel around into the cell to provide power, etc. Um, Sorry, say the question again. I got myself off track there. We're talking about fire,
Yeah,
but
just that you had said
yeah.
it
Oh,
cools down.
yeah, I remember now. Right. And so the problem is, to do that, you need oxygen. If you starve a fire of oxygen, it doesn't burn, right? The mitochondria is the same thing. And so, how can you starve the mitochondria of oxygen? Well, what you can do that a lot of people in like college, or high school bio 101, and then again, probably in college bio 101, if you went that far, uh, uh, um, they have these pictures in the textbook, and it's like the mitochondria is this big sausage-shaped thing, and it lives over here, and the endoplasmic reticulum lives over here. But in reality, if you look at an actual image from a microscope, the two things are like draped around each other. And so in very close proximity, you have these two organelles that are competing for the oxygen, right? And if the endoplasmic reticulum is using too much oxygen, that means less oxygen is getting to the mitochondria. That means less fire, right? You're dampening the fire if you're burning the oxygen elsewhere. And that's essentially what the theory boils down to is just simply that, if we make an analogy, um, what this looks like to me is if you think about a wood stove, right? If you want the fuel, if you want to burn the fuel in the wood stove very quickly, you just open the damper, right? And the wood stove gets hot and it glows orange, and a lot of heat is released very quickly. Um, and if you want to turn that down, you just close the damper, you let less oxygen through, and it burns very slowly, and you have this slow smoldering fire that goes all night, and there's still fuel left in the morning. And so, from a very, simple perspective, the way to kind of control the metabolism is to control the oxygen that flows through the stove in the analogy, or that flows through the mitochondria in the biological setting. Um, and that looks to me like what's happening here. All of these, like what is when we talk about these polyunsaturated fats, what is the reality of why are they bad, right? That's the question that I think assumption that people have is, well, they're bad because they oxidize. Um, okay, but what about that oxidation is causing the problem, right? And that I think is really where the rubber hits the road. And I think that's what we're gonna over the next, you know, 5 years, maybe less, hopefully less. I think that's where the debate needs to move, right? There's a lot of counter examples of, so in mouse studies anyway, one of the things you can do is you can block the ability of the mice to create antioxidants, or specifically, you can block the ability of them to make glutathione, which is the fuel that drives the body's um, antioxidant system. And if you do that, you actually prevent diabetes. Um, and so that sounds counterintuitive to people because, right, we've uh, conditioned to think that, well, we eat these polyunsaturated fats and they oxidize and they cause all this damage, and that's the problem. That's what's causing the diabetes. But if you get rid of the antioxidants, you actually prevent the diabetes. And so that is surprising and counterintuitive to a lot of people. Here's another example. If you give rats vitamin C or vitamin E, both of which are antioxidants and both which will prevent the kind of auto oxidation of these fats and the oxidative breakdown of these fats, that also causes uh, metabolic syndrome in these rats. At least if you give them enough vitamin C or enough vitamin E long enough, they will become insulin resistant, right? Um, and so it's hard to explain that if you think that uh, uh, these uh, oxidizing, and lipid peroxides are not good, right? They can stick onto your proteins, onto your enzymes, and they can cause damage, and they can damage the mitochondria. And certainly, if you have too many of them, they can overwhelm the cell and cause really big problems. But I don't. It doesn't look to me, given the weight of the evidence, like that is the sort of core pathway by which they're acting. Um, if that was the case, then taking more antioxidants would help prevent those problems, and that's actually not what we see in the real world. And you also see that in humans, right? When we give people long-term supplementation with uh, antioxidants, the results have not been good, right? The clinical trials, these long-term clinical trials of humans giving them supplementary vitamin E and vitamins, um, more often than not, it looks problematic rather than helpful. And so the question is why? And so that's where, I think we need some new ideas, and that is why I believe that why I've been writing these articles saying that I think this has more to do with oxygen flow, right? The reason um, that the fats oxidizing is bad is that it takes oxygen to oxidize the fats, and so those fats are wrapped all around the mitochondria, and they're essentially competing for the oxygen flow into the mitochondria. And from a biological perspective, that's important because I assume that the problems that we have, we see with diabetes and, other essentially determined by the organism, right? The organism is animals exist in the world, and what they're doing is they're reading signals from the environment, right? They're reading day length, red light, the what kind of fats are in the foods that they're eating. If you're a mammal, what if you're eating worms and ants, what times of which of the earliest mammals were eating uh, insects, we believe, worms, insects, things like that. So the and we know that when we look at insects, the fat composition of the insects is different in the tropics than it is in, if you're very far from the equator and sort of winter's coming, right? So that's another signal from the environment. And so the idea is that the organism is essentially integrating all these signals, day length, red light, diet, um, polyphenols play a role in this, all these different incoming signals, and perhaps levels of oxygen, and it's trying to figure out what should it be kind of fattening up and slowing down its metabolism because winter's coming, or is it time to breed and reproduce, and in that case it wants to burn its metabolism kind of hot and fast. And um so with that as a perspective, this idea that uh the organism should have some control over whether or not it's oxidizing the polyunsaturated fats that it consumes is, to me, that's very logical that, 700 million years of animalian, is that a word? Animal evolution would have essentially what its metabolism is going to do. And it seems like the solution that the animal has come up with is controlling um, a couple of these key enzymes, and one of those is the one that controls the oxidation of linoleic acid, and that seems to be the sort of gateway determining factor of whether or not you're going to have um, a lean, clean burning, hot running metabolism, or whether you're going to have a slower, more torpid metabolism and eventually develop diabetes. I think the evidence that D6D predicts diabetes onset is overwhelming. I don't think there's any question about that. I think we can question that, like my mechanism might not be correct, right? That might be proven wrong about the oxygen competing in the endoplasmic reticulum for you know, competing for oxygen use in the ER versus in the mitochondria. Maybe I'm off base about that. Maybe that's not a powerful enough mechanism, but that's my guess. And but very clearly, the root of the problem lies in this conversion of linoleic acid to arachidonic acid, and how quickly that's happening. Um, One good thing about that is it clears up a kind of a paradox, right? So a lot of people in the community, if you are sort of pro seed oils, if you're pro linoleic acid, one of the things that you will point out ultimately is that people with high linoleic acid levels their um, in their body tissue have better health outcomes, and that's true, right? That's undeniably true. At least in a modern society where everyone on average is sort of consuming the same amount of linoleic acid, that's true. And so that seems contradictory. So this conundrum is, or this paradox saying that okay, if linoleic acid is bad, then why is it that people in the same society where on average everyone is eating more or less the same amount of linoleic acid, you take two people eating the same amount of linoleic acid, the one with more linoleic acid in their body tissues tends to have better health outcomes. And the reason is that that's the person who is not um, oxidizing their linoleic acid, right? In a super nerdy way, we would say that person has less flow through D6D circuits. Um, that's the nerdy biologist way of saying it, but the person who is is oxidizing all of their linoleic acid and converting it to arachidonic acid and then converting it into these oxylipins and then getting rid of it, um, that person has the worst health outcomes and they have lower body levels of linoleic acid. So it's sort of like the linoleic acid is the problem, but um, it's a different level of problem depending on your genetics and depending on whatever else you have going on that might have pushed you into this um, phenotype or whatever you want to call it. But if you are converting linoleic acid to these oxylipins very rapidly, you will have low circulating levels of linoleic acid, and you will become very likely to develop diabetes, and or probably obesity, and or probably heart disease, and or maybe cancer. Um, and so I think that paradox is actually very easy to solve. It's actually quite transparent. If you get studies coming out of Northern Europe or Spain or China, I think you have this very compelling picture of the problem is the conversion of linoleic acid to these oxidized lipids. Um, if you're doing a lot of that, you tend to have low levels of linoleic acid, and every time you're eating more linoleic acid, you're contributing to that problem, right? And so, if that is indeed the problem, then maybe you don't want to eat more linoleic acid, right? Even though, even though high levels of tissue linoleic acids is associated with better outcomes, but if you try to chase that, it's not going to work for you because you're the one who's converting all your linoleic acid into these bad things, and you're the ones with the health problems. So if you eat more linoleic acid, you're just going to do more of the bad things, right? That's pretty much how it shakes out, in my opinion.
It's fascinating. I want to run through some quotes from Dr. Ray Peat since you mentioned his name, um,
Sure.
just to kind of provide another context to these factors. These are just kind of scattered. I found it on a website, raypeatexplain.com. I just want to generate some quick quotes from some of these similar processes and see what you think. This is from May 2020 Ray Peat newsletter. At low altitude, when a tissue's oxygen consumption increases beyond the blood's ability to deliver oxygen, as in an intensely working muscle, the tissue activates the glycolytic process, converting glucose to lactic acid as a source of additional energy, right? He talks
Yep.
about, I know these are kind of scattered, but I didn't have time. I just kind of listening to you, I wanted to get some of
No,
these.
that's okay.
Um, like he has another one that says using calcium channel blockers and acetazolamide to treat the new disease because of their therapeutic effect in high altitude pulmonary edema. He didn't mention it, but both of these drugs can correct the tissue deficiency of carbon dioxide. So there seems to be that there's this tissue deficiency in carbon dioxide that's at play in the cells as well, right? And that's kind of related to this glycolytic growthy process here, this growthy state that you're talking about. I'm just trying to connect all these dots together.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah, so let's go with those two. That's good, right? So, y-
because he's talking
you
about
got two things going on. The first one is 100% correct, right? So, we have an oxygen sensor in our cells called HIF1A, and what that is doing is it's looking for the actual oxygen availability within the cell. And if oxygen, when oxygen availability gets low, it switches the cell into glycolysis. And glycolysis is, cancer cells are glycolytic. You don't really want your cells to be glycolytic. You know, uh, uh, Things like, I mean, stem cells are glycolytic, but at least when they start to grow, they're very glycolytic. But you don't want your body to look like stem cells. Stem cells are baby cells. As an adult, you want to have adult differentiated cells, right? And the CO2 being released from the cells actually is what cells that are producing a lot of CO2, presumably have a higher metabolic rate, and um, that CO2 actually dislodges or competes for oxygen binding to hemoglobin. And there's a name for this process, and I always forget what it is, but the CO2 concentration itself coming out of metabolically active tissues, is that the Bohr effect? Do I have that right? Compete for oxygen binding to hemoglobin, and they cause the oxygen to be released in the tissues that need it, which is a pretty cool trick. And so, if you have cells, and glycolytic cells don't produce a lot of CO2. So you have this kind of compounding effect of you know, once the cell gets a little bit low in oxygen, it starts to do more glycolysis. If it's doing more glycolysis, it's going to release less CO2. The tissue is then going to get less oxygen. It's going to become more glycolytic. And so what you have is this kind of spiral effect, right? Where A is leading to B, is leading to C, is leading to A, leading to B, leading to C, and that's not what you want, right? You want your tissues to get oxygen. And so in that context, this process that I'm talking about, of if the cell is using even a relatively small amount of oxygen to to desaturate this linoleic acid and to oxidize this linoleic acid, you're putting yourself in a position where it's easier to kind of fall into that glycolytic spiral. And I talk in the series about the evidence that, in fact, uh, um, if you look at the adipose tissue in obese humans, the tissue is glycolytic, right? It's not using, the mitochondria are not using oxygen. Instead, the adipose tissue is preferring to do glycolysis, and that uh, really boils down to oxygen availability.
so it would stand to reason to
And this,
maybe get to the mountains if you can get high altitude if you have been poisoned by decades of linoleic acid consumption, right? I mean,
yeah, I
it's
mean,
interesting, this
right,
area I'm in is was known, first established as these these healing springs up in the mountains. People knew intuitively sometimes what to do with health. Getting inside of a CO2 enriched hot spring, high altitude is probably a good idea, right? That's probably the reason why
hun-
people.
yeah, 100%. And I think the idea is that in a higher altitude, lower oxygen environment, the um, the CO2, the mechanism is sort of ironic, but what happens is, the CO2 is released more slowly, and it builds up. and the hemoglobin is still very good at lower oxygen about getting oxygen out of the air, and so you're still at essentially 100% oxygen hemoglobin saturation. And so having that extra bit of carbon dioxide can actually help deliver oxygen to tissues, sort of ironically, because the actual oxygen concentration is lower up there, of course. Um, that's I think that's my understanding of the idea behind the high elevation delivery of oxygen.
Yeah,
Um,
he says altitude and a milk-based diet are obviously two important thermogenic factors that slow the accumulation of harmful adaptations. But there are many other controllable factors that could extend longevity even more. Reducing inflammatory factors is important, and personal choices can make a big difference. For example, choosing easily digestible foods to reduce endotoxin, avoiding the polyunsaturated fatty acids that interfere with cell respiration and form inflammatory prostaglandins. Maybe you could explain how your work you're talking about fits in with prostaglandins. Avoiding antioxidant supplements that create a reductive excess. There you go.
right,
Brad
there you
Marshall
go.
saying amen, amen.
Amen.
And they, by the way, they just hit it off just fine and dandy when we brought them on the obesity panel. Brad Marshall and Ray Pete, they were like long lost buddies from a playground in the sky. And choosing foods that contain anti-inflammatory thermogenic compounds such as citrus fruits with their high content of flavonoids that support cell respiratory functions. That's got rich B vitamins and all that, right? So, how does all this fit together? I just want to see the master theory of it all, and it has to
Right.
be brought
So
down to
so
language that everybody can understand, you
right.
know?
So everything you just said is all this that all ties in perfectly. Like so those icosanoids, right? The icosanoids are one of the things that the oxidized linoleic acid can become, right? Like, and when I talk about the linoleic acid stealing your oxygen, well, what once it goes to that D60, the delta 60 saccharides, it can become like, 75 different compounds. I don't know how many. There's a lot of them. Some of them are more common than others. The eicosanoids are pretty common, and so those are the oxidized lipids, right? That are ultimately getting um, they're ultimately getting glucuronidated and eliminated in the urine. But that is the process in action that I'm talking about. And, and there's a study that this is sounds a little bit contradictory, but it's not really. They put people on a plane and they flew them to Colorado, and they just looked at their bloodstream and said, "Are there more or less of these eicosanoids, of these oxidized lipids?" And in fact, that first day when they fly to the mountains, the eicosanoids, doubled or tripled or something
Right.
like that.
Yeah.
And so that's exactly what we're talking about, right? Because on day one, oxygen pressure is lower, your blood cells haven't, or your blood vessels have not dilated and adapted yet. And so at first, on that first day, you get oxygen constriction. And so your body is now shifting to a more glycolytic mode. And one of the things that kind of can um, sort of ironically, in that mode, that your body starts producing these. It sees the oxygen dropping and says, "Oh, we need to get glycolytic." And one of the ways it can actually help do that is by producing a bunch of these eicosanoids to kind of mop up the oxygen that's left, and that helps you make this glycolytic shift to dropping oxygen
Yeah.
levels.
Yeah,
Uh, and
he said a steady increase of retained CO2 with increasing altitude occurs in those who adapt. People who fail to adapt experience a loss of CO2 with an increase of lactate. My question is
right,
is there a threshold where you're so screwed up by linoleic acid and stuff that or you're diabetic or whatever that it's actually very harmful for you to be at altitude, because it's like you're not going to adapt. Like if you don't pass the threshold stress test, you kind of languish in accelerated aging conditions. That's interesting, right? Or do you like the longer you're in there, like theoretically your body will eventually kind of like catch up and increase its metabolism to handle the new situation. Curious, huh?
yeah, I mean, I don't know. We're gonna have to solve that one experimentally, I think. There's a lot there's a lot going on there to answer that question. What I will say is that in it, in addition to the fact that linoleic acid has increased in the diet, that's somewhat avoidable going forward. If you know to avoid linoleic acid, and if you're conscientious and you're paying attention, you can sort of avoid that. But what's harder to avoid is the fact that our bloodstreams are all full of microplastics and PFAS, which is a type of PFAS is like Teflon, and it was in all these products that we've lived with for the past. They've recently sort of been banned or phased out, but Scotch Guard, right? People spray Scotch Guard on your couch to prevent stains from soaking into the couch, and it's amazing because you can spill a glass of Coca-Cola or red wine on the couch and wipe it right off. It was like it was never even there. Obviously, people love this, but those Teflon-like molecules that we sprayed onto our couches um, are now circulating in our bloodstreams, and those molecules, those signal a whole bunch of these endocrine factors, PPAR alpha, uh, PXR, also called SXR. There's a bunch of them, and those things contribute to, um, again, coming back to the same point, they contribute to control of that D6D, and they contribute to how much of that linoleic acid you're going to be oxidizing and converting to the eicosanoids, right? And so the linoleic acid, I think, in let's say on the order of a year, if you strictly avoid linoleic acid, I think a lot of that linoleic acid will come out. In fact, ironically, if you are not doing that well, you might have low levels of linoleic acid to begin with, and this varies a lot. Like we've seen people doing uh, the omega quant test, right, is a test that I've promoted in the past, and you can test your red blood cell membranes and look at the composition of those. So what we see is when people actually test their membranes, they have wide range of values, right, for their omega-6 levels. But the things that are harder to outrun are these things in your blood, the PFAS and the microplastics and estrogenic compounds in your blood. And so those are going to be harder issues. Like it's not like getting linoleic acid out of your diet isn't hard enough. Um, but these are going to be long-term issues that we're going to have to think about because these things are obviously everywhere in the environment. How do you avoid plastic as a modern human being?
And how do you scrape
Um,
all that
I don't,
plastics? Yeah.
yeah, I don't have the answer to that question. I know that it's bad, but I don't know how to fix it. So that's one aspect of it. That's a big question, and yeah, I don't know about your question. Are you ever too broken for high altitude to benefit?
Yeah.
I guess that that
Well, you notice I
time
noticed
and time is going to have to tell us.
I noticed a lot of the like it's very that there is a noticeable decrease in excessively obese people in the area of Colorado that I'm in, and
Yeah,
the very few that I do meet, actually it's interesting. The very like two that stand out that I saw had oxygen masks on. They had to have and that's the wrong thing to do. Ray Pete would snatch that out of their
right, sure.
nose very gently. Um, but the idea is that, we don't want that. That approach is not going to allow them to adapt, apparently, if they're, or maybe they're in a serious situation where they have to have that. I don't know. But it makes you think about what you said with diabetics and the lack of blood circulation to the brain and all that. I mean, and the irritability, the tiredness, the some of the symptoms that go along with that disease, which is like huge. I mean, how are children having that? I mean, how many chicken nuggets did you have to feed your child to give it diabetes by the age of 10? I don't mean to be mean, but good
Well,
Lord. I
Yeah,
mean,
and I do
it's like a
think
steady
that,
supply.
well, but I think it's more than that, right?
Or it's
I do
PFAS,
think
huh? It's the PFAS, the
I
licking
I
plastics. Oh God.
I do think
Yeah.
more and more, right? Well, the two things reinforce each other, right? The if you have these things in your bloodstream that are, these environmental toxins or whatever you want to call them, that are activating these if the fuel for that enzyme is linoleic acid, now you have a child who is, has this PFAS and these plastics, and now you start feeding them chicken nuggets, the maybe that child needs to eat far fewer chicken nuggets than a child born 50 years ago before there was as much PFAS and plastic in the environment. And I do think that's part of the reason that you see the increase over the generations. And there's another reason for that, which is in mice, when you give them these environmental obesogens, what you see is that you give it to the mother, and the mother herself doesn't necessarily become obese, but the her the baby mice born from that mother will uh, become obese, and that effect will last five generations. You don't have to give the same environmental obesogen to the next five generations. There's some kind of epigenetic change or shift that happens, um, that puts them into sort of a different metabolic mode. So you have this multi-generational change.
Yeah.
Um, and so that, that's a little
You, you know
terrifying,
what's
frankly.
interesting in
But
all this? I'm just going to throw another random monkey wrench over here. Gilbert Ling's theory about the cell being a gel, like a polarized gel material rather than this cell membrane model. And I recently, I was excited to hear him mentioned by Professor Gerald Pollack when he was speaking at this Tesla Tech conference I went to about what he called the easy water or the fourth phase of water. Are you familiar at all with Dr. Pollack's work on this? And this, yeah,
I have not studied it. I believe that
I mean,
there is,
they're,
cells are,
I was just gonna say that it's like a
yeah, cells
gel-like,
are very,
it's a gel-like structure, this fourth phase of water, which is something similar to the cell structure. And I just wonder if maybe, not to, I want to get your thoughts, but just maybe that food could help people who have cellular dysfunction, and being able to like drink easy water. I mean, because I saw different inventors presenting things that were showing what Gerald Pollack was talking about, like how to produce this type of gel-like water that's like superfood, rich with hydrogen and everything your cells need.
yeah. I mean, like I say, I don't, I can't, I haven't seen that research, so I can't speak too knowledgeably about it. But I
Have you
can
seen
say that
Gerald Pollack
there's,
stuff at all?
I haven't,
Yeah,
haven't.
we're gonna bring you two
Uh,
together.
but there is a lot interesting. Yeah, there's a lot interesting happening inside of cells. You have um, just a lot of, yeah, they are very like there's a lot happening in there. Let's say that I think we can we can certainly agree on that. Um, um, and then yeah, and so let's talk about this. This is interesting. We sort of talked about this before we started recording, and then I went away from it. But um, one of the things that I think is interesting on this is the idea that I mentioned the omega quant test, and that looks at the fat composition in your cell membranes, and like I say, that process is happening very continuously. So I think I already mentioned this article, "Can you stand in the cell membrane, same cell membrane twice?" with the idea that the fats are kind of flowing through these cell membranes like a river, like water flowing. And if you have a high flow rate, that's when you're gonna get into trouble and get diabetes, because that river is taking your oxygen away. And there's a guy called X Fat Loss. I don't know if people are familiar, but he's got a blog, and um, he's someone that I also interact with on social media, on Twitter, and he did an experiment using that omega quant test, and he what he showed was that he could change by changing his diet, he could change the amount of linoleic acid in his cell membranes by like half in 24 hours, just by changing his diet, taking this test every day, I think, and altering his diet, or every other day maybe. He would change his diet and send his omega quant test in, and what he showed is that very reliably, if he goes from I think he was doing his he does this fat fast with heavy cream, and he was doing that, and he was showing that his linoleic acid levels would be one way, and then suddenly he would switch to what I call a swampy diet, where you're combining different macros. So I think his diet was lamb and rice in this case. So, the lamb is providing fat and protein. The rice is obviously providing carbohydrates and some protein. And so when he went to that quote unquote swampy meal, he saw his linoleic acid levels plunge, by like a factor of two. So my explanation for this, that something about that quote unquote swampy meal, if you will, we see people um, struggle, like someone who, if you look at the diets that have worked for people trying to lose weight, right? Usually you have to restrict something. If you just keep eating, you know, pizza, right, which has protein and fat and carbohydrates in it, you usually don't lose a lot of weight on that. And so there are some people who have done low fat diets work for some people. Low carbohydrate diets, keto diets, obviously have worked for a lot of people. More recently, people have been experimenting with low protein diets, like i.e. the sugar diet, which is all the rage on on the internet right now. And Amber O'Hearn years ago did the diet she calls uh, keto AF. Is basically you're eating beef, but you eat the fat first until you're satiated, and then you just eat a little bit of the lean. So that's kind of a protein restricted diet. And I did the emergence diet, which is protein restricted. And this group called the Lambing Lab has shown in mice that this protein restricted diet is it can be very effective. And so what you see is all of these restrictive diets are helping to you restrict one macronutrient or another, and it seems to help with your weight loss, insulin sensitivity, and all these things, rather than eating quote unquote in the swamp and combining all three things. That's a long-winded way of saying, so what this experiment that n equals one, but that X Fallows did on himself, is so interesting to me, because he went from a very restricted diet to a swampy diet, and immediately on day one, that linoleic acid level plunges. And it's just like the people who got on the plane and flew to Colorado, and you see that burst of eicosanoids, because where did the linoleic acid in his membranes go when he switched to a swampy diet? Well, they were released by these enzymes that release them all the time, and they became eicosanoids, and they were eliminated in his urine. And then over the next few days, they kind of get gradually replaced, and they return to baseline. But um, that experiment, that n equals one, shows you how dynamic that system is, and that anything that you do when your kind of insulin resistance changes, you're changing the flow of oxygen through the cells, you're changing the flow of energy through the system, and you see that rapid drop and that is in fact enhanced by, or maybe even caused by, that enzyme delta 6 desaturase version of um, to these eicosanoids and these oxalates. And I believe that what happened in that experiment is that something about that dietary change, it could be the increase in uh, branched chain amino acids can contribute to insulin resistance if you're not good at suppressing your branched chain amino acids. It could be some of the fats that were in the lamb were that were different than were with the cream. It could be the carbohydrates were um, too much energy was flowing into mitochondria from the increase in insulin from the carbohydrates, right? It probably all of these things are playing small roles. But at the end of the day, what happens when you start to become insulin resistant is that linoleic acid is released from the membranes. It becomes oxidized. That contribute oxygen in the cells. It contributes to that conversion to a glycolytic stage. Lactic acid is released. And so somehow, all of those processes are connected. And I just thought that was a really interesting N=1 experiment that was done.
Yeah, that's fascinating. You've been doing the thing. You've been doing a low protein, low carb thing, right? How is that going for you?
Yeah, for the time being. So I've been sort of one of the things that I've realized, I've talked a lot about reductive stress over the years, and I was focusing on NADH, and there's another interestingly, cells are very cool. There's two channels within the cells, right? We talk about, or I talk electron through cells and how that process works, and um, the cells that flow through the NADH pathway are there to make energy, and the cells that flow through the NADPH pathway are there to create growth. And the cell can choose to send more calories through NADH or more calories through NADPH. And we could get in the weeds about how it does that, but I don't think it's necessary. Um, and so the two main fuels that the cell can generate NADPH from are glucose and amino acids, mostly glutamine and glutamate, but a lot of but several different amino acids. And so I was thinking, okay, if there was it was partially inspired by X Fat Loss has this protocol where he's doing rapid weight loss with heavy cream, and Amber O'Hearn with her uh, keto AF diet, which worked really well for her. I thought, okay, my goal is to get to a Ray Peat style. I don't even know if I want to say Ray Peat style. My goal is to get sort of to a French style diet where, like, the French eat uh, baguettes and butter and jam for breakfast. I think that sounds lovely, right? And so my goal is to essentially become an efficient carbohydrate burner. And I've had periods like when I did the emergence diet where I've had that work really well, but it's hard for me to maintain, and I have to be really focused to do that consistently. And so I thought, well, in the fall, they essentially do a fat fast in the winter, right, where they're burning primarily their own stored body fat, and in the summer they're lean and they're much more insulin sensitive. And I finally said, okay, fine. What if I just mimicked that? Um, and instead of essentially, except for now that I'm going to essentially do this more of a fat fast, and because if I eliminate the glucose and if I eliminate the amino acids, then I've eliminated the two main sources of NADPH, which is what the body uses for growth, which is what the body uses for de novo lipogenesis. It's the fuel for fattening you up. Essentially, it does more than just fatten you up, but that is the fuel to fatten you up. And so I said, what if we just took those two legs off the stool? What happens? And so far so good. I've been losing weight. My blood glucose has dropped, and so my sort of goal is to get rid of the excess weight, and then when I'm where I want to be now, I don't have when I try to become an insulin sensitive burner of carbohydrates. Once I've lost the weight, I don't have to fight the extra free fatty acids being released by my fat cells. that are fighting with my ability to burn this glucose.
Yeah. And I think
So
that might
I've kind of,
explain why I have seen very few people who were very overweight lose their weight on Ray Pete's type eating or croissant eating, butter and all that stuff like you're talking about. It doesn't seem to be maybe the solution for the actual if for cases of significant, weight needing to be lost, and it may be that
I've had many.
this dogmatism might have to be kind of mediated to the point where the best of the keto science and the best of the bioenergetic science has to work together in tandem to help save people off of the Titanic that they're on, because there's millions of people.
Yeah, and I think so. And I like I say, like I very much desire to be, a lean carbohydrate burner, but I do think there may be a situation where you have to kind of do some type of fat fast or keto fast to like get the weight off in the first place. And then, because something
It,
like
isn't the
so.
key trying to get the ratios of your fat right? If you deplete, because your body preferentially burns the linoleic acid, right? So, and then the monounsaturated second, right? So it's like the idea there is to just eat a high, rich, saturated fat diet, and then like you're burning this other less healthy fat, and then you're getting those ratios in a right alignment, and then somehow at a certain percentage threshold, theoretically, you can then start eating sugar again, or.
Yeah, so I really focus on uh dairy fat as the primary source of fat, right, that I'm doing right now, because the fat that goes into your mitochondria is a blend of your stored body fat and your dietary fat ultimately, right? And so um if you are overweight, if you're obese, your fat is not very saturated. I can show you 100 studies that will prove that this is true. Right. So you have relatively unsaturated body fat if you have extra pounds. And so and that problems energetically, there's a host of reasons, and I'm not going to get into the weeds on it now. But part of what I'm doing is consuming the most saturated fat that I can, and that is dairy fat. I have some issues with coconut fat, not my favorite. And specifically the reason, if people are wondering, is that the some of the fats, the shorter chain saturated fats in coconut fat, activate PPAR alpha. I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole anymore on this episode, but that dairy fat is the most saturated fat that we have by a lot, right? So depending on what study you read, dairy fat might be somewhere between 55 and 70% saturated, whereas beef fat is like less than half, and pork fat is maybe 40%. And so that dairy fat helps you to push the fat that's actually going into your mitochondria in a more saturated direction, which I happen to believe is um, the better way to go for a lot of reasons. Partially, it tends to enter the mitochondria slower. That gives your mitochondria more time to, collect oxygen and burn it cleanly rather than kind of overwhelming it and smothering it. And there's also, if you read, I've written quite a bit about, Peter Dobromilski's blog Hyperlipid. He also talks about the benefits of saturated fat and why that happens. And it's needless to say, it's complicated, but there are a variety of mechanisms which I believe, if you can get the fuel that's actually going into your mitochondria to a more saturated state, I think you're better off than living in the kind of very unsaturated body fat of the obese, right? And so, but you can do that on a daily basis. You can alter that position of the fuel that actually goes into the mitochondria to burn. That's the good news.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Well, let's leave it there, Brad, and I appreciate you coming on as always. Fireinabottle.net is your website, and you can find them on Fire in a Bottle on X, and that's where you're mostly posting, right?
Yeah, there and also the Reddit group r/saturated fat.
What are
That
they?
is
Are a
another.
lot
That's
of
a great
people?
community.
Are a lot of people doing what you're doing? Have you told them that you're doing the high fat keto thing?
You know, I've, I've kind of had my head in the sand, and I have not been posting publicly much because I've got a lot,
Yeah.
got a
So
lot
we are
going
we
on.
breaking news here? Uh-oh.
We're kind of. I think this is. I think this is breaking news. Yeah, yeah,
Breaking news. Brad Marshall is keto AF.
kind of. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Boom. For now. Until
I'm
he's
not that.
bioenergetic in French is F, right? AF, right? French.
Right, right, right. So that's the goal. So that's the goal. Is next summer at this time, I want to be eating baguettes with butter and jam for breakfast,
There's
and doing it in a lean way. A healthy, lean way with good blood glucose control and all of that.
well, so there's some kind of joke there, like a Ric Flair thing or something. To be the French man, you have to be the keto man or something. I don't know. To beat the keto man, I don't know. You got to do something. We got to come up with some kind of catchy phrase to explain
Right.
this kind of theory you have in mind that before you run in the fields of croissants, you must walk in the fields of sour cream and beef kibasas,
Yeah.
right? Is that your
That's right.
go-to,
That's right.
or do you have other things?
That is no that has been it. Beef kielbasa. If you want to have some meat in your diet that is low in protein, beef kielbasa is the winner. And also low in PUFA. Um, when you make sausage like that, you use to make a profit. Beef kielbasa is pretty cheap, so to make a profit, you use the absolute minimum amount of protein that you can use to bind all of that fat together, and so. Beef kielbasa is a fantastic source of low protein meat. It's even
Is it,
lower. There's less protein, like the fat to lean ratio is higher in beef kielbasa than most bacon, even.
wow. Is there other
Yeah.
ones that you're exploring?
I
Beef
mean,
bacon or something
yeah, that's
else?
about, I mean, all beef hot dogs
Yeah.
are kind of the same thing. Those are the best. Even the beef bacon is leaner than the beef kielbasa. People
Wow.
don't realize that because it's a magic trick that the sausage maker does by emulsifying it. You make this uh, paste that cooks together, and it seems like it's solid meat, but it's mostly just the beef fat.
And folks, Brad knows all
And as a
about.
former as a
Yeah.
former hot dog maker and a former sausage maker, I can
Yeah.
tell you all about
You know
the
all
tricks
about
of the
sausage
sausage
making.
making room.
Yep.
Yeah, yeah. But if you just read the label, if you just read the nutrition labels, this will confirm what I'm telling you.
Well, I'm sure your hometown Ithaca is very proud of your research, and one day you're gonna walk in there and they're gonna say, "Man, you changed the world." We're gonna put a little statue up for Brad Marshall, maybe.
Well, I hope so. I hope so. We're working on
Yeah. Well, Brad, you're always a self-effacing person, very humble guy, and I always want to tell you that I appreciate what you're doing, and you're always a positive guy. And I got to, meeting with you in person, I saw how positive you are, and it was very impressive. So keep up the good work. You got to have a can-do spirit.
Well, thank
Brad's not
yeah,
profit
thank you,
motivated.
David, and
I don't think Brad's a profit motivated guy. I think he's truly a big idea guy that wants to change things and make people's lives better, and that's important.
absolutely
Yeah.
right. And no, it was amazing having you in town, and we will keep this collaboration rolling.
All right. Take care. Have a good one.
All right, thanks, David.
If you have questions about what we've talked about, you can email us hello@aneighborschoice.com, or any comments or suggestions or anything else you'd like to contribute to the conversation. Of course, your comments in the comment section are always appreciated, but we also like the long format of email. It's a little old school, but we like it. So that's it for today. I'm David Gornoski. Godspeed.
If not himself, then there's not to say the words it reveals, and not the words of what it is, the record shows.